conflict, which has evolved considerably over the last 7 months. Conflicts are not static. War is an ever-changing sea, if you will. And for the last 7 months, even though people in the West will never ever admit it, the truth is that President Putin has exercised enormous restraint with regard to the use of his military power. We've never seen more than 20% of the Russian ground force in Ukraine. And most of the regular Russian ground force was subsequently withdrawn after the first 4 months, during which the Ukrainian army that we built over several years was largely destroyed. What you have in Ukraine now is a mix of various volunteer organizations, militias, some allied forces like the Chechens, Kuban Cossack volunteer organizations. They've turned out to be very good fighters, plus the Wagner mercenary group. It's also turned out to be very effective on the ground. But the real Russian army, with its combat forces, has largely pulled out of the fight. I thought they would come back in August, but apparently the decision was made not to do that. And what's happened now, I think, in the Kremlin is that Mr. Putin and his advisors have all concluded there's no chance of negotiating an end to this conflict. I think he really clung to that hope, even in the middle of April, when it was clear that we in London would not permit Zelensky and Kyiv to make any sort of compromise, to accept neutrality, for instance, off the table. So now we're dealing with a different Russia. And what you saw yesterday in 3 waves were 202 missiles and loitering munitions attacking specific targets all over Ukraine. This is something that they've always been able to do. They have the precision-guided munitions and missiles just as we do. This time they not only hit so-called critical infrastructure, they also hit the secret police headquarters of the Ukrainian state, which is a notorious organization engaged in murdering people and forcing people into enemy gunfire at gunpoint, recruiting at gunpoint. But they also hit a number of analyst cells, places where people are putting together intelligence pictures. In other words, they've signaled that there's nothing happening in Western Ukraine that Moscow doesn't know about. And they've also signaled there's nothing over there they can't reach and destroy. So I think we're seeing a glimpse of what's going to happen later on this fall, which I predict will be major offensives on the ground once the soil freezes. That's coming. And this will be much closer to what a lot of us thought would happen at the very beginning. Massive offensives designed to utterly annihilate what remains of the Ukrainian armed forces.
The Western media is trying to paint these Russian airstrikes, these attacks, as inconsequential. That they're not really hurting Ukraine. I've heard this from a few propaganda mainstream media outlets over the past 24 hours. And I'm just going through the laundry list of targets. I mean, hitting Polish forces that were amassed and ready to invade Russia proper, hitting NATO targets, hitting, as you mentioned, the SBU, hitting thermal power plants. There are people who are fleeing Ukraine in droves right now because they have no fresh water, they have no running water, they have no electricity, they have no internet. So the Western media says these attacks were inconsequential. Ukraine's fine. What do you say to that?
President Biden apparently felt compelled to call, or at least his handlers felt compelled to have President Biden call Mr. Zelensky, reassure him that we will continue to supply him, that we back him, there will be no change. And at the same time, Mr. Zelensky pleaded with more air defense systems because the Russian attacks also destroyed 80% of Ukrainian air defenses. So if someone is suggesting this was not consequential, we have to look at those developments and we rapidly conclude, no, that's wrong. Mr. Zelensky is in a panic, unquestionably. They've got serious logistical problems moving things around in the country.